Welcome, everybody, to the Financial Inclusion Podcast. My name is Owen Muzambi, and I'm the host for today. So, the Financial Inclusion Podcast is really just a discussion on inclusive finance in South Africa, but also on the continent. What we are questioning is, are the most vulnerable populations in this country accessing the right and quality financial services? And if they are they using it? And if they are these products making an impact on their economic livelihoods? So to join me on this discussion is my co-host, Hangwi Liphadzi, who's also a financial inclusion researcher. Our special guest for this episode is Marlon Parker, who is a founder at RLABs, also known as Reconstructed Living Labs. Marlon is also this year's World Economic Forum Social Innovator of the Year award recipient. For more of these kind of topics, please like, subscribe our channel. Enjoy. So you're doing quite a lot of work, Marlon, and I think the question I have is you've managed to sort of include so many disadvantaged people into participating in the economy. And the outcome is that they've got an income, they're getting cash, and the question then would be, are they ready to sort of like be able to manage all of this income and cash that they're having?
Yeah, that's so powerful because we find that a lot of our young people, once they earn the money, a couple of days later they run out of cash, right? And how do we ensure that just having a bank account is not the end all of looking at what financial inclusion is? The fact that someone, because we see that yes, they receive their money, but a day, 2 day, 3 days later they go and knock on the door of a loan shark. So how do we ensure that when we think about financial inclusion in South Africa and broadly speaking on the continent, it really takes a lot of those other aspects into account. And this we see with a lot of our young people, when once they have their first livelihood. For many of them, they might be the first person to even have a bank account in their family. So these are the realities that they are facing. All of a sudden, they're having to kind of deal with all these complexities. And I do think when we think about financial inclusion, we really have to become intentional in what does inclusion really mean,
Mhm.
and what does it mean in our context.
Correct. I think you've taken me to the days when I first got my first job and how that money just disappeared. But I think that's a story for another day. Coming back to you, Hungry, you were you introduced us with a definition of financial inclusion, and I'm wondering, should we have a financial inclusion definition that speaks to where we're at, where we're located as a country in South Africa, an emerging economy that is totally and vastly different from the western side, where some of these definitions come from. What are your views around that?
Yeah, I think context becomes important in any policy that you would be doing. And I do think in South Africa, our context is quite complex. So it needs a lot of us to really zone into it. What is it that we're going through?
Yeah.
What is the best solution that we can implement? Because what you find for example, is in a country like South Africa, where a lot of people are excluded, right? What does inclusion mean? Because there's so many of us who sit on the outskirts of the financial system. And then how can you include us in this small, well developed, as it is said, internationally renowned financial system? Because at the same time, you still feel excluded even when you are within a country like South Africa. Those are questions that are key in our contextual understanding. But at the same time, ownership becomes very important, not necessarily an ownership of the bank, but a sense that I am contributing to a system that is now also rerouting that contribution back to me and my livelihood. So you might find that where I am at with the financial system, we are almost at loggerheads because they seem to be driving for example, their own systems in a way that would not necessarily be beneficial back to me. So that's just a question mark, right? It's a way of answering your question by asking more questions. But I think what I'm trying to do there, Owen, is to drive a little bit more into how do we unearth our context back to ourselves when we are talking about financial inclusion. Because I want to feel like I'm contributing not just to a bank that sits somewhere else, but a bank that belongs and will contribute to my society in a way that is sustainable for me too. So that is something that is important when we speak financial inclusion. And of course, context is everything. But I do think South Africa's context still needs to be dug more deeper so it comes more alive, and maybe we can implement in accordance with with that context.
I think quite a few valid points there.
Maybe if I may, Owen, just to come in there quickly, I think the and I love what Hangwi was saying. When we think about inclusion, when we think about context, it's everything. If you look in South Africa, someone, if I want to use my banking app, I most likely might not have the necessarily the app, my phone might not be of a certain quality to be able to utilize the full extent of that. Or in some cases, if I want to use the website or the browser, now it's not data free. It means that I have to pay data to a premium to access my money. And we do know, with all honesty, people that low income earners generally spend more, a premium, more expensive their data because they buy smaller bundles. So all of a sudden, so if you really want to consider financial inclusion, you have to you have to think about all of these other facets. The fact that if I want to engage with the bank, I now have to go and jump into a taxi, I must pay a taxi fee, right? And then all of these things, I think when you really want to consider inclusion, how do you ensure that the context ensure that as simple as it is for someone in a well-established suburb, for someone in a rural area or a township can have equal access to financial services. And that's the reason why some people decide, hey, you know what, it's too much of an effort, it's too expensive for me, let me rather not go down that route.
Thanks so much, both Marlon and Hangwi. And I think at this point, I'm just going to remind our audience what the topic is, and the topic is financial inclusion for who, for whose agenda. Because I think that's one of the most common catchphrases these days of get people financially included, but for what reason? And I think that's something we're trying to unpack and kind of interrogate. Who's really benefiting from having people have more access to these institutions and different financial products that are out there? Might be credit, might be insurance, might be bank accounts. Who's really benefiting, and who's really benefiting from this push of getting people access to financial services? There's quite a lot of research
And
that's kind of.
Owen,
Oh yeah, sure, Hungry.
maybe I'd like to then pose a question back to you now that you've also helped our audience understand the question again,
Yeah.
right? Because when we read the definition states that financial inclusion is the provision, right? So that's the
Yeah.
first word that they use. So essentially, you can already tell who the subject of the definition is. So are we, in trying to answer financial inclusion for who, is the subject the financial institutions that are providing the services much more than it is the people who need to use it? Hence what Marlon is saying, there's so many hurdles that you have to go through before you can actually make use of products, right? So maybe the people who are not the first priority in the first place, if you take into consideration the definition we read up top. I'm asking you, Owen. I'm just flipping the tables on you there, Owen.
Is the question, are you asking me who's the subject?
Yes, given the definition that we read at the beginning as well.
I think there are different dimensions to it, and I don't think there's only just one subject in all of this. I think there's quite a few players and actors that are supposed to be included in the definition, and I think if they are not included in the definition, then there's something that's totally wrong with the definition. My perspective that I come from is very much from a development point of view, and I think what we want to see is not new fancy bank accounts and new fancy credit terms, but beyond that is what all these different products can actually do to change the life of the person on the bottom. I think that's what, from our perspective, comes from. But we have to balance it out, right? Balance it out because we can't expect banks, for example, to give bank accounts for free and they don't get any kind of profit out of it. There has to be a balance between the cost of giving financial products and the impact it has on the individuals. And I'm not sure if that balance is totally has been achieved in a country like South Africa, where I think some of the banking fees are probably some of the highest. So we have, yes, get people access to bank accounts, but once their money comes in, half of that money is taken out because of the charges from those bank accounts. Have we really achieved a balance between providing tools that change people's lives and perhaps managing the overheads of the people that are providing the tools? So I don't know the answer to your question. I think that's in a short sense, but I'm advocating the position I come from is that there has to be a balance between, yes, providing nice tools, but tools that don't then at the end of the day reap out the savings and the income that people are getting from being included into the economy from parties like RLABs and Marlon. So that's just my view. Not a straight answer at the moment.
Well, there are no straight answers with
Right.
financial inclusion, to be fair. There's a lot of different facets to take into consideration. Yeah.
Mm. I think I want to kind of take a leap forward to kind of ask a different question, and this is back to you, Marlon. I think we read in your profile that you're very much involved in digital transformation, and digital is one of the things that our labs is doing on the ground, or digital inclusion. Is there in the future of the work of our labs anything around digital financial inclusion? I think we see a lot of products coming out in digital financial inclusion, payment processes, easy access to credit. What are you seeing in your field of in the digital space, and particularly what might you have planned for us in the digital financial space or financial inclusion space, the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we realize that when we think about communities in, again, our township communities, there's a high usage of digital tools. People actually spend a lot of time on their mobile devices.
Yeah.
I don't think people realize the magnitude of how many hours people spend daily
Mhm,
on social networks, on messaging apps,
mhm,
watching videos. It's an absolute reality. And one of the things that we've found is, how do we utilize, so the one thing where there's access is the mobile device. How do we leverage that tool as a mechanism, right, that to enable people to access, be it proper financial education? How do we utilize it to give people with tools that is not predatory, which means we're not pushing products to you, or even the funeral policies, you know, nothing to that effect, but it helps you to see how can you best utilize your finances to make better decisions. And the mobile devices is a key, can be a catalyst in that. Unfortunately, when we think about financial education and financial inclusion, I'm narrowing down to South Africa, we find that a lot of that is driven through your financial institutions. So they mandated to do that, but I also believe that we have lots of room for startups, for ventures, for community-driven initiatives to really begin to utilize digital tools to help people make better financial decisions. My favorite type of way of doing it is reach people where they are. If people are currently spending a lot of time on WhatsApp or whatever it might be, let's utilize that tool as a mechanism to drive the financial education and financial inclusion agenda. I also believe that there's a lot of fintechs and things that's doing things in the payment space and trying to give people easy access to credit, and I mean, everybody's trying to address that. But my question is, and I think again coming back to what Hangwi said, financial inclusion is not just oh, I can get a loan, or I can get. It's also if we can help someone grow that income, like wealth building. How do we make that simpler and simplified for people, even people in low income communities? Because all of a sudden we find that people are living from, very much the example you gave. Couple of days down the line, there's no more there's no more money, there's no more funds. How do we, and that cycle keeps on repeating. So now I borrow to help me till the end of the month, and as life becomes more expensive, the I borrow more, which puts my family in more, in more debt. And I do believe there's a huge opportunity for digital tools that can also help people earn, help people increase their earning potential through, be it investments, be it through things such as gig jobs, um, and those are things that I'm really excited to that I'm very passionate about. And people are using the tools already. So how do we ensure that people are able to access these things? And then one last thing I do want to encourage, whenever anybody's doing things around financial inclusion, especially institutions, I would want to encourage them to consider the data cost. Make sure it's either data free. You don't want to put that burden of the cost of data on the consumer, on the person itself. And that's something that I think it's very important to note.
Mm-hmm. You're right. You remind me, Marlon, of when you're speaking about how these technologies are increasing access to different products. One of them just being loans and credit. How all of that access also has a dark side to it. Where I think in preparing for this podcast, some of the material we read talks about how easy access to credit in countries like Bangladesh through microfinance has um, led to some farmers that took on this debt being overburdened, but
Yeah,
also indirectly committing suicide. I haven't
yeah,
read any kind of literature around that in South Africa, but I'm sure because the literature is not there does not mean there are not people out there who are suffering from overdebtedness, particularly because they've had so much easy access um, to different tools and financial fintech products that give them too much access to too much credit. I guess then the question I might just pose to you, Hungry. I don't know if in your work if you've come across it. How then do we still promote innovations that help us access financial products much easily, but yet at the same time protect people from scams or protect them from being taken advantage by some of these owners of the innovations that we have. Be in some of the research we've read in the last 2 years of COVID, um, the data shows that there was on one end a lot of adoption of technological tools and financial products or fintech products that gave people access to um, different financial products quite easily within the COVID period. But in that same period, we've had the most highest numbers of fraud and scams as well at the same time. So how do you balance out protecting the consumer, but also giving them access to all these different innovations that lead to better and improved financial inclusion? Any thoughts that you might have come across in your work?
Yeah, I think if you were in any other place, the answer was going to be financial education and financial literacy. But
Yeah,
I'm not that way inclined. My view is a bit skewed, right?
yeah.
So, partly, I mean, some of what you mentioned earlier about literature, for example, in South Africa, apparently people have so much funeral cover. It's as if more than 3 people die in their family each year. So, that's how much funeral cover they have. So, this also forms part of the national policy that shows just the decisions that people are taking even when the access is offered, right?
Hmm.
So my interest would be more around basic education much more than it is individuals on the output end. So my question is, the average matriculant in South Africa, right, when by the time they matriculate, what kind of thinking capacity does this person have from a critical thinking point of view in order to engage engage with the systems that they're going to find. That's just matric. But also when you go to graduation level or people who are in higher education, by the time they leave, how is their thinking from a critical thinking point of view in order to engage the world with its vast ideas and vast opportunities? What kind of leverage can they give from what they were taught? And I think that's where we need to ask ourselves, what kind of people are we trying to create in this country, right? And I like that Marlon is from reconstructed living. So essentially there's a need to reconstruct, to work and turn things upside down, because it's easy to say let's have more financial inclusion programs, let's bring soccer players, let's bring celebrities to teach people how to use their funds. But I think by the time someone is already past the age of 18, if their base is not sufficiently giving them critical thinking skills to engage with the world sufficiently and leverage all the difficult things that life will throw at them, then that person is not going to be teachable sufficiently at the point of being given a loan to understand what a balloon payment is for a car and all that kind of stuff. Because learning, and this happens a lot, you see it when people speak about soft skills. Do the people that we are doing have soft skills enough to engage with the world? And I'm sure Marlon can expand on that. But what you will find is that I don't think we're doing enough work with our education system, because that's is just as important as it is for financial inclusion, I believe. So I'm not going to quickly say bring in the biggest celebrities to come teach people how they dealt with their money. And South Africa is a good example. So I'm a big football fan, for example, Owen, and we've seen soccer players come in, make millions, and just squander the millions. So one wonders, is it a function of what is the reason there? And I think the basic education, by the time these people were 18 and had matriculated, I don't think they were sufficiently given the opportunity to think critically about the world outside financial inclusion, but generally, because that's where it is important.
Yeah, maybe just if I may, Owen, to add to that, I think it's it's so important, and it's one of the conversations we've had. Should how people should deal and use money and their finances. How does that impact on basic education? Should that be taught in basic education? I think we all are for that, but I do believe that if we really want to change habits, and I mean, it's the same like if you look at one of the big industries is when people matriculate, the matric ball in South Africa. It's people spend huge amounts of money. They go in debt for that one night. I'm not even talking about weddings or funerals. I'm talking about a matric ball, and now they brought it down to prom in primary school when someone is in the last grade. Families put themselves in debt purely for that one event. And again, it comes down to financial education. I'll spend 20, 30,000 Rand on one night when my child is in matric, but I don't have money for them to go and study the next year. So how do we ensure that that kind of level of education is accessible, and it's ingrained in people from a very, very early age? I absolutely agree with that. And unfortunately, we're always going to find entities that's going to become predatory when they see, okay, there's now, we're going to make it easier for you. You can now buy now, pay later. You can, which is all great things, right? But do I really need this new device? Now I'm putting myself in debt. So these are all things I think that we have to consider.
Mm. Well, thanks so much, Marlon. And I think just expanding a bit more about how such small events like a metric prom or metric end of year gathering is such a simple activity on the outside, but yet when it comes to just the financial um, health of some families is actually contributing to destroying families. But I guess it's a cultural thing that we might need to change, and maybe to kind of ask the last question to anyone who's willing to answer. How then do we make sure that our culture as people in South Africa. The way we kind of look at the world and the way we behave does not have an impact on our financial decisions. I know it's not an easy question. A lot of work we've been seeing, or results we've been seeing, is that definitely Hangwi financial literacy is not really having the impact we were hoping for, or that we'd want on behavior change. There's a lot of more in play, which is people's social culture, social norms, the way we're brought up in families, the way we're made to understand what money is, and the way we're also connected to money. How do you think in the future, we could really help South African people to really make the right financial decisions that is not influenced by some of the social norms that we see around there?
I can go first, but what I'd say is you need more social norms. I think you just need more positive ones,
Positive.
because social norms do drive a lot of our behavior. We just have ones that are quite toxic, and I think the example of football players is a good example that I've given up top. That the social norm, even around the profession, is very toxic, but also you see it with male female relationships as they're explained on social media, between the spend of money and who gets the money and so on. So those are social norms. So I think you need refreshed ones, much more positive ones. And to bite my tagline, this whole conversation, reconstructed ones, ones that will be more positive, that have got a much positive value at the output end. And the way you do that, I definitely think is the kind of output that you have by the end of matric. What kind of child do you have? Not what marks did they get. So I'm not asking that. I'm also not even asking how much they get just for mathematics and science. I'm asking the kind of person that you have there. What kind of decisions will they take? So that's when you will start creating new norms and ideas. And of course, other community players would also come into play, whether you're talking about churches or religious groups, in also having their own perspectives about it. It doesn't help if the church says money is the root of all evil, and then you go into your society and your society says money is the basis of having a life. You can only have a life when you've got this amount of money. So these community, again, contexts need to speak to each other in the creation of a new society. So I definitely think we need to leverage those norms, but make them much more positive. And you do this from how you would raise your kids and those kind of things. So institutions would come and be very key. Institutions like reconstructed living, I think, as a way to pass it on to Marlon, actually.
Your comments,
Yeah, thank you. I think if you definitely, if you want to change your behavior, you have to change your worldview, right? So people's view about money needs to change. Their view about finances has to change. And we find it very common that people traditionally would live for a specific date in the calendar month, either for your social grant or your salary, or the family income is coming in. And you already know, I remember growing up, I knew which day will be pension, when my gran would get a social grant, because we as a family, we were dependent on that. But then I also knew I had to go to my neighbor to go and borrow money for the family. So I had to go and ask. The child will go and ask. So you get so kind of prone to these things. And I love what Hangwi just said. How do we create these positive social norms? How do we change people's worldview that money is just a tool, right? That and you see that excessive spending. You see how a family that's already struggling would go to a big retail store, go and purchase a small sneaker on credit, and the child is most likely going to outgrow it a couple of weeks down the line. But it's because for them, it shows some form of status. It shows some form of that we can. And these things, I think, has such a big influence on us as especially influence on young people. And I do think if we can change that worldview, if we can then we would naturally see the shift and the change in behavior. And unfortunately, when you look at a lot of things that are showed out in the media, it is about material things, right? So the reconstruction of the mind comes when you are able to kind of reconstruct people's view. And to reconstruct the view starts with addressing what is that internal need that the person has. And if the person's need is to always belong, I would spend more on material things because it makes me feel part of. And because of that, I won't have very good financial management. To really addressing this kind of this change of worldview when people think about finances and money, I think it's going to become very, very important.
I think you started something there, both Marlon and Hangwi, and in particular when you spoke about churches and pastors and all of that. But I think it's not a topic I want to kind of dig into right now. I think to the audience, we are talking financial inclusion or inclusive finance, and in particular exploring the question financial inclusion for who's really benefiting from having access to different financial products, and is it really balanced? Our consumers protected from too much access to different financial products? We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'd like to maybe ask maybe your closing remarks and closing remarks from you, Hangwi, just around this topic of financial inclusion, and from you, Marlon, what should we expect from RLABs in the next coming few years? How are we going to be spreading or making hope contagious in the next coming few years? I think you've done quite a lot from the time you started, but what more should we be seeing from you? We can start with you, Hangwi.
Oh yeah, we'll keep continuing to have these conversations as a way to also reconstruct our perspectives about the world. Hence, we are called Financial Inclusion Perspectives. So I just ask more and more people to join us. There'll be more conversations that we'll have. Yeah, and it was a pleasure to have this conversation with you two gentlemen.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you, Hangwi. I think from an RLABs perspective, we believe that to make something contagious, you need to grab it and catch it. If we want people, and we've been kind of on this mission of how do we begin to address inequality through wealth building? Okay, and this is probably a story for another day, and building generational wealth. I mean, I'm sure we've seen it many times in our communities that when there's a little asset that is left behind, you find families fighting over that house that was left in the, and families break up because of that. And we've seen it over and over again. It's because there's no wealth mentality. And one thing as RLABs, what we believe we need to be doing over the next couple of years, it's yes, equip and inform and develop people so that they can definitely can earn more. But how do we get them to a point where they realize it's not just about the earning of the today, but it's about the building of wealth that can last for legacy for generations, building this kind of wealth legacy. And how do we get people, even when they find themselves in a township, that they can begin to realize that I'm never going to be able to survive on this active income. Somewhere along the line, my cost of living is going to always surpass what I'm able to do. But how do I begin to take those small actions that can make a difference, that can last a lifetime? And I think that's basically something that we really are embarking on, because it's sad to see families break up because they now have to sell a family asset, and people don't talk because they didn't get the right cut, or there's anger, and I've seen it so many times. Whereas that asset should be creating more value for you as a family for generations to come. And I think that is something that we really have to begin to address in our communities, because we've seen too much of it. We've seen families just being broken up because of finances. We saw families, being disrupted because of not having the right kind of access, and that is something that as RLABs is what we are embarking on in our journey, and of course with a number of different partners, to say how do we make sure that we have this generational wealth installed in our communities. Because we don't even use the word endowment in our townships, isn't it? And like, it's like, I want a salad so that I can get my cut now, and less than a year later, that money is gone. It's been spent. So that for me is something that I think we really want to get right.
Yeah, I really love this generational sort of perspective that you have, and in the work that you're doing, work that kind of transcends this generation we're in now, but it goes further and further, and making sure we build wealth that lasts for much longer. But I think with that, I'm gonna close our episode today on financial inclusion perspectives. So, Marlon, Hangwi, thank you so much for having coffee with me. I didn't see people having coffee at some point. I guess the conversation was exciting. But what we have been talking about is just financial inclusion and inclusive finance, and we are asking the question: inclusive finance for whose benefit? Who's really benefit in from all this push to get access to finance? I think you can join us again for another episode where we explore many more topics just from different angles, from innovators, from change makers, but also from policymakers and people that are really trying to change the state of inclusive finance in South Africa. Thank you for having us today, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Thank you, Marlon and Hangwi.